He made America laugh. But behind the smile, he was hiding something Hollywood never wanted you to know. From secret love to an abandoned estate in Hawaii, Jim Nabors' real life was nothing like Gomer Pyle. So what really happened in the final years of this beloved star? Stay with us, because this story is deeper, sadder, and far more powerful than you think. Before he became Gomer Pyle, before the uniform, the laugh, and the national fame, Jim Nabors was just a quiet kid from Alabama, trying to breathe. He was born in 1930 in Sylacauga, Alabama, the youngest of 3 children. Growing up in a small rural town, he developed the kind of charm and warmth that would later shape his most famous role. But his early years were far from easy. He suffered from severe asthma, the kind that kept him indoors, away from sports, away from friends, and sometimes away from his own breath. His family didn't have money for advanced treatment, so Jim had to live carefully, avoiding physical activity, avoiding risk. But inside that quiet boy was a performer waiting to get out. Instead of running on the field, he joined his school's glee club and choir. He played the clarinet. He discovered he could make people smile, and more importantly, feel. That spark only grew stronger in college. At the University of Alabama, he didn't study acting. He studied business, but on the side, in fraternity skit shows and local performances, he kept feeding the flame. Still, he never thought it could be real. "I was from a small town, and God knows I was no leading man," he once said. "You know how Hollywood was back then? Everybody was a hero. The only thing I could possibly think of was that I could have been a character actor in a Western or something. I never had any thoughts of going into the business." But life, like Hollywood, loves a good surprise. Jim Nabors never set out to be famous. After college, he didn't head for Broadway or chase auditions. He took the practical route, like a good Southern son. He found work, steady, quiet work, the kind that didn't ask you to be seen. One of his first jobs? Typist at the United Nations in New York. He wasn't there to charm world leaders. He was there to type fast, stay quiet, and pay his rent. From there, he moved south and into television. But not in front of the camera. In Chattanooga, Tennessee, Jim worked as a film editor at a local TV station. He was the guy who trimmed the footage, cleaned up the transitions, made others look good. Eventually, he followed opportunity west, landing in California, and got hired by NBC to do the same thing, edit. He was still invisible, still working behind the scenes. But California had a way of tugging at dreamers, even the ones who didn't believe they had the right to dream. So at night, Jim tried something different. He took the stage at local clubs and cabaret theaters, not as Jim Nabors, but as a collection of wild, funny hillbilly characters full of Southern twang, bad grammar, and wide-eyed confusion. It was satire, silly, but the audiences loved it. And then came the moment that changed everything. Somewhere in the middle of one of those rambling routines, after the punchlines, after the giggles, Jim sang. Not a joke song, not a parody. He opened his mouth, and out came a voice so rich, so startling, that people stopped breathing. He had a powerful, trained baritone, the kind that belonged in opera houses, not comedy clubs. It was as if 2 different men lived inside him, one to make you laugh and one to make you cry. That contrast, the goofy bumpkin and the soaring singer, became his signature. And one night, someone very important happened to be in the crowd. Andy Griffith. The star of The Andy Griffith Show was already a household name. He had an eye for talent, and what he saw in Jim Nabors was more than talent. He saw something rare. The next day, Andy offered him a role, a one-time guest spot, playing Gomer Pyle, a well-meaning dim-witted mechanic who worked at Mayberry's gas station. That role was supposed to last 1 episode. Just 1. But audiences saw what Andy saw. They fell in love. Not with a polished Hollywood hunk, not with a leading man. They fell for Gomer's goodness, his honesty, his unshakable innocence. And for the man behind it all, who brought something real to every laugh. The character was an instant hit. Viewers begged for more. So Jim came back again and again until he became a permanent fixture of Mayberry. And soon, CBS gave him his own show. Jim Nabors, the former film editor from Alabama, was now the star of Gomer Pyle, USMC. It was a dream he never dared to imagine, and somehow it had found him anyway. Gomer Pyle, USMC, wasn't supposed to exist. Jim Nabors' role as Gomer on The Andy Griffith Show began as a throwaway character. Just one episode, a small part, a mechanic with more heart than sense, written for laughs, not for legacy. But when the episode aired, something unexpected happened. The audience didn't just laugh, they connected. There was something disarming about Gomer. He was awkward, yes, a little slow on the uptake, but he was good, truly, earnestly good. The kind of good that didn't feel fake. The kind of good America wanted to believe in. CBS took notice, fast. They expanded Jim's role on The Andy Griffith Show, bringing Gomer back again and again, until he became a series regular. But even that wasn't enough. By 1964, just 1 year after Gomer's debut, CBS gave him something almost unheard of for a character that had started so small, his very own spin-off. Gomer Pyle, USMC, took the Mayberry mechanic and dropped him into the United States Marine Corps, a recipe made for comedy gold. Every episode pitted Gomer's innocent optimism against the gruff discipline of his drill sergeant, Sergeant Carter, played brilliantly by Frank Sutton. Gomer meant well, but his constant misunderstandings, bumbling mistakes, and accidental triumphs drove Carter insane, and audiences couldn't get enough. The show debuted strong and only got bigger. By its final season, Gomer Pyle, USMC, wasn't just a success, it was the second most watched show on television. Millions of Americans tuned in each week to see what this unlikely Marine would do next. The show ran for 5 full seasons, from 1964 to 1969. It could have gone longer, much longer. But Jim Nabors had other plans. At the height of its popularity, while the ratings were still sky high, Jim made a bold and surprising decision. He walked away. Why? Because even though the audience still wanted more, Jim knew he had given Gomer all he had. "I wanted to try something different," he later said. "I felt like I was starting to repeat myself, and that's never a good thing in show business." It was a risky move. Leaving a hit show at its peak? In Hollywood, that's practically unheard of. But Jim wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't trying to squeeze every dollar out of the moment. He was listening to something quieter, something truer. And just like he had done with every big moment in his life, he stepped forward with quiet courage. He left the uniform behind. But Gomer Pyle, the wide-eyed Marine with a heart of gold, was already etched into television history. And Jim Nabors? He was ready for the next act. When Jim Nabors stepped away from Gomer Pyle, USMC, many assumed he was taking a break, maybe to rest, maybe to reset. But Jim wasn't stepping away. He was stepping into something bigger, something that had always been part of him, but that the world had only glimpsed through a few scattered moments on screen. His voice. Underneath the exaggerated Southern accent, beneath the comedic timing and wide-eyed delivery, Jim Nabors carried one of the most surprising, powerful singing voices of his generation. A deep, resonant baritone that stunned audiences the moment he let it out. Fans of The Andy Griffith Show and Gomer Pyle had caught glimpses of it. Every now and then, Gomer would sing, and people would do a double take. Was that real? Was he lip-syncing? How could that voice come out of that character? But it wasn't a trick. There were no overdubs, no studio illusions. That was Jim. Every note, every breath, every chill-inducing crescendo. In fact, Jim had been a classically trained singer long before comedy brought him to television. He had studied the craft quietly, never using it as a gimmick, never trying to leverage it for fame. But once Gomer Pyle ended, he finally had the space to let that part of himself shine. And shine he did. He launched a new chapter of his career, one built not on sitcoms, but on stages, live shows, concert halls, variety specials. In Las Vegas, he headlined packed venues, earning up to $40,000 a week. He released over 30 albums throughout his lifetime, many of them full of gospel hymns, Broadway standards, and easy-listening ballads. 3 of his albums went gold, each selling over 500,000 copies. It wasn't the kind of music dominating radio in the rock-obsessed 60s and 70s, but that didn't matter. His fans came for comfort, for warmth, for the familiar sound of a man who made them feel safe. And perhaps nowhere was that love felt more deeply than at the Indianapolis 500. Beginning in 1972, Jim performed Back Home Again in Indiana at the Indy 500 almost every year, turning it into a tradition that became just as iconic as the race itself. He would walk onto the track dressed in a modest suit, no costume, no character, just himself. And when he sang, with that soaring voice and unwavering grace, you could hear the engines pause. He performed it for 42 years. It became part of his identity. Not Gomer, not the Marine, not the funny man, just Jim. And in those moments, you understood something simple, something powerful. This man didn't just play characters, he touched people, deeply, unexpectedly, with the truth of his voice. And sometimes, that truth said more than comedy ever could. Even as his music career flourished, Jim Nabors never lost the one thing that had defined him from the beginning: his humility. He didn't care about charts, he didn't chase headlines. He simply wanted to entertain, to bring a little light into people's lives, whether that was through laughter or song. That spirit earned him not only fans, but deep, lasting friendships, especially with one person who would remain by his side for more than 5 decades, Carol Burnett. Their connection was instant. Carol was already a powerhouse in comedy and variety, known for The Carol Burnett Show, and she saw in Jim something rare, not just talent, but kindness. She once called him her good luck charm, and meant it. Every season, without fail, Jim Nabors was the very first guest on The Carol Burnett Show. It wasn't just tradition, it was affection. He brought something to the stage that no script could write: warmth, familiarity, grace. But their friendship wasn't just for the cameras. Off-screen, they were family. Jim became the godfather of Carol's daughter, Jody. He offered her advice, laughter, and a steady presence in a business that often felt anything but steady. Their bond grew even deeper when Jim moved full-time to Hawaii in the 1970s. It was he who first showed Carol the beauty of the islands, eventually convincing her and her husband to buy land near his property. Years later, she would say, "Jim and I remained close friends for 52 years. I miss him. I love him." But Carol wasn't the only one to hold Jim in high regard. In 2001, the United States Marine Corps, the very institution his fictional character once hilariously stumbled through, honored Jim Nabors in real life. They made him an honorary Lance Corporal. And then in 2007, they promoted him again to honorary corporal. A rare gesture of gratitude from a military organization to an actor who had portrayed them not with satire, but with soul. At the ceremony, Lieutenant General John F. Goodman said, "Gomer Pyle taught the American people that Marines are people, that they have a sense of humor in spite of what they go through." Standing at that podium, Jim couldn't help but smile. "Well," he quipped, "it took me 38 years to get to Lance Corporal, but only 6 to get to Corporal. I guess I'm on the fast track now." That was Jim Nabors, humble, self-aware, and always ready with a punchline that didn't hurt, but healed. In a town where egos could fill stadiums, Jim remained grounded, a man who knew exactly who he was and never needed to be more than that. He didn't just play nice on screen, he was nice. In every room, every stage, every quiet moment backstage when the cameras stopped rolling. And that is why he was more than a star. He was cherished. For all the love Jim Nabors received, there was one part of his life he never spoke about publicly. Not for most of his career, and not because he was ashamed, but because he had to. Jim was gay. And in the Hollywood of the 1960s and 70s, that truth wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly to a career. There were no pride parades on studio lots, there were no out A-listers hosting late-night talk shows. There was only silence, or exile. So Jim chose silence. He wasn't hiding, not really. His closest friends knew, his co-stars knew. He just didn't tell the press, because telling the press meant risking everything. And then came the rumor that would chase him for decades. In 1971, a strange story began circulating in Hollywood gossip columns. Jim Nabors and Rock Hudson had secretly gotten married. The tale was absurd, but it had just enough sting to feel dangerous. It started innocently enough, as a joke. A couple of gay men in Southern California, known for throwing elaborate spoof parties, sent out a satirical wedding invitation. It read, "You are cordially invited to the marriage of Rock Hudson and Jim Nabors." It was meant as a private in-joke among insiders. But it didn't stay private for long. Somehow, the press got wind of it, and what was never real became something scandalous. Tabloids printed it as fact, rumors spread, and fans began whispering about America's most wholesome Marine and the Hollywood heartthrob known for playing romantic leads. It didn't matter that Jim and Rock were never romantically involved. The damage had already been done. The two men had been friendly before, both navigating the same unspoken world of closeted stardom. But after the rumor exploded, they stopped being seen together in public. Not out of bitterness, but out of survival. Jim never commented publicly on the story. He didn't file lawsuits. He didn't give statements. He did what he always did. He kept going, quietly, graciously, because he knew the world wasn't ready for the truth. Not then. And in some ways, that silence was a sacrifice, a protection for himself, for the people he loved, and for the career he had built with so much care. There was no coming out party, no confession to Oprah, no viral moment of vulnerability, just silence, and the quiet cost that came with it. But in that silence, there was also strength, because Jim Nabors didn't live a lie. He lived his life truthfully, respectfully, just not publicly. And for that era, for that version of Hollywood, that was radical enough. While the world speculated, Jim Nabors was already living his truth, quietly, with the man he loved by his side, Stan Cadwallader. They met in the late 1970s. Stan was a former firefighter, level-headed, warm-hearted, a man who didn't care about the spotlight or who Jim was on TV. He only cared about the real Jim. And Jim, he had finally found someone he could just be with. No disguises, no performance. Just life, shared. They didn't make a show of it. There were no red carpets, no paparazzi shots of candlelit dinners, but there were shared homes, shared routines, shared mornings in Hawaii with the sound of waves outside their window and coffee cups that never needed to be filled twice, because one always knew what the other wanted. For 38 years, they stayed together. Decades passed. The world began to shift. And by 2013, when same-sex marriage became legal in Washington state, Jim was 82 years old. Most men at that age think about legacy. Jim thought about love. In a quiet ceremony surrounded by a few close friends, Jim and Stan made it official. No flashbulbs, no press releases, just vows, just truth. "It was time," Jim said simply. "We'd been together almost 4 decades. I think something's gotta happen." He didn't care if the world knew, and by then the world mostly already did. But for him, the act of marrying Stan wasn't about making a statement. It was about making a promise, one that had already been kept for years, but now had the dignity of being named out loud. Jim wasn't an activist. He never saw himself as a trailblazer for gay rights. He said it best himself, "I'm not ashamed of people knowing. It's just that it was such a personal thing. I didn't tell anybody. I'm very happy I've had a partner of 38 years, and I feel very blessed." There's something quietly revolutionary about that. Loving someone not for headlines or hashtags, but simply because your heart chose them. In an industry obsessed with appearances, Jim chose authenticity. In a culture that demanded silence, he found a voice, not in speeches, but in decades of love. And Stan was there, at every chapter, through surgeries, through spotlight, through retirement, and in those final moments, when Jim took his last breath in their Honolulu home. They never needed to prove anything, because they had already proven everything. Not every battle is public, and not every hero fights with noise. For Jim Nabors, his greatest struggle came quietly, without fanfare, without tabloid headlines. It started with something so small, a nick while shaving during a trip to India in the 1980s. A tiny cut that, tragically, led in something far bigger, hepatitis B. He didn't realize it at first, but the virus began its silent work. Jim carried it in his body for years, without drama, without complaint. Until one day in 1993, his body began to show the wear. Exhaustion, swelling, pain he couldn't explain. When he checked into the Mayo Clinic, the diagnosis was devastating: liver failure. For most people, that would be the end of the road. But not Jim. Because standing beside him was Carol Burnett, his dearest friend, his guardian angel. She didn't hesitate. She rallied her contacts, made calls, pulled strings, and helped Jim find a liver transplant doctor. She sat with him through the hard nights, waited through the terrifying hours of surgery, and when it was done, she was the first to hold his hand. The transplant was a success. And with it, Jim got more than just time. He got clarity. He knew he had been given a second chance. He slowed down, toured less, spent more time in Hawaii in the arms of Stan and under the whispering palms of the home he loved. But that new liver came with a cost. His immune system was never quite the same. Still, Jim lived another 23 years after that surgery. That's more than 2 decades of sunsets, of songs sung, of birthdays celebrated, of coffee with Stan and laughs with Carol. He never used his illness for sympathy, never spoke about it on talk shows. He just kept going, grateful, gracious, and quieter than ever before, until November 30th, 2017, when he passed away peacefully at home in Honolulu. Stan was there, just like he always had been. And just like that, one of television's warmest hearts beat its last. While Jim Nabors charmed the world with his goofy laugh and golden voice, he was also quietly building something far more permanent than fame. A life of stability, generosity, and wealth. By the time he passed away, Jim's net worth was estimated at $40 million. That number didn't come from flashy deals or scandalous headlines, but from smart, steady work and even smarter choices off-screen. Let's start with the home that became his heart, Hawaii. Jim first fell in love with the islands in the 1960s. He wasn't just another celebrity looking for a vacation house. He was looking for peace. In 1976, he sold his home in Bel Air and bought a 340-acre macadamia nut farm on Maui. Yes, really, a sitcom star turned nut farmer, and he loved every minute of it. He didn't just live in Hawaii, he gave to it. Eventually, he sold that farm to the National Tropical Botanical Garden for $4.7 million with a single request: preserve it. And they did. Because Jim didn't want to sell land, he wanted to leave a sanctuary. But that wasn't all. On the island of Oahu, Jim owned a stunning 6,000 square foot estate with 170 feet of oceanfront in the upscale neighborhood of Honolulu. After his death in 2017, that home hit the market for $15 million. 3 months later, it sold for $12 million. And if that wasn't impressive enough, in 2014, at age 84, Jim bought yet another 170-acre property in Hana, Maui for $2.7 million. In 2020, it was listed for $4.5 million. It's not an exaggeration to say Jim Nabors built an empire. Not one of excess, but of intention. Every move he made was quiet. Every investment thoughtful. He didn't hoard his wealth, he shared it. He supported the arts, he gave to local Hawaiian causes, and he made sure that Stan, the love of his life, would be taken care of long after he was gone. Jim Nabors lived modestly for someone so wealthy, but maybe that was the point. He had already lived big, on screen, in songs, in laughs. In the end, the homes he left behind weren't just properties, they were testaments to a man who knew how to build more than a legacy. He built a life. Jim Nabors didn't just leave behind a fortune, he left behind a feeling. For decades, he gave America something rare: laughter without cruelty, charm without ego, and a reminder that kindness can be just as powerful as charisma. To millions, he was Gomer Pyle, the wide-eyed, well-meaning misfit who never quite fit the mold, but always found a way to matter. But to those who truly knew him, Jim was something far more special. A man who lived quietly, loved deeply, and left the world softer than he found it. He didn't come out with fanfare, he didn't need to. His love for Stan Cadwallader, kept private for nearly 4 decades, wasn't about headlines, it was about home. It was about finding someone who stayed not because of who the world said you were, but because of who you really were when the cameras turned off. Jim never shouted for rights, he simply lived them, with dignity, with loyalty, with truth. That, in its own way, was revolutionary. In a time when being gay could end your career, Jim Nabors built one anyway. In a time when fame often demanded fiction, he chose quiet authenticity. And maybe that's why his story still resonates today. Because behind the voice, the smile, the southern drawl, was a man who walked through life gently, but made waves without even trying. We remember Jim Nabors not just for who he played, but for the space he carved out, for the lives he touched, and for showing us all that success doesn't have to be loud to be lasting. In the end, his greatest performance wasn't Gomer Pyle, it was being Jim. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that quiet courage matters, then help keep stories like this alive. Subscribe, share this video, and let others feel what you just felt. Tell us in the comments, what did Jim Nabors mean to you? Or what part of his journey hit home the most? Because in the end, this isn't just a story about one man. It's about all of us. About love, truth, and living life with grace, no matter what the world expects. If you believe that everyone deserves to live and love authentically, then let's keep that message going. One voice at a time.